You begin with a familiar assumption that knowledge, once acquired, guarantees truth. You rely on the coherence of your ideas as if coherence were enough to confirm reality. Yet as you examine this confidence, a doubt quietly forms. You realize you rarely question the foundation from which your judgments arise. You interrogate conclusions, but not the instrument generating them. Al-Ghazali confronted this same issue in the early stages of his inquiry. He noticed that certainty often rests not on verification but on habit and repetition. What feels stable may simply be familiar, and what feels convincing may be nothing more than practiced agreement between your thoughts. You start to wonder, if certainty depends on an unexamined mind, what does certainty actually mean? Al-Ghazali lived in a time when intellectual authority was fiercely debated. Philosophers argued through logical systems, theologians defended doctrinal coherence, jurists grounded truth in legal reasoning, and mystics sought inward clarity. Baghdad was a center where every method claimed superiority. Amid this diversity, Al-Ghazali recognized a deeper problem, not a lack of knowledge, but the lack of a foundation that could verify knowledge. The issue was not disagreement between schools. It was the instability shared by all of them. You begin to see the issue. If every path claims certainty, which one, if any, can anchor it? You look more carefully at the ways you come to know anything at all. Sense perception feels immediate, yet it is vulnerable to distortion. Reasoning appears reliable, yet even its strongest proofs depend on premises it cannot secure. Inherited tradition offers guidance, yet it often repeats assumptions without investigating them. Al-Ghazali reached a similar point. He realized that each domain of knowledge collapses under sustained scrutiny. If senses can mislead, and if reason can become circular, and if tradition can be unexamined, then none can provide the certainty they claim. You are left with a question that cannot be ignored. If the mind doubts everything else, why does it never doubt itself? You start to notice something subtle. Your thoughts change, but the ability to observe them does not. You see a distinction between the content of thinking and the awareness that witnesses that content. Thought is variable, awareness is steady. Thought interprets, awareness notices. Thought argues, awareness remains quiet. Al-Ghazali recognized this distinction as essential for understanding. For him, certainty could not be grounded in what fluctuates. It had to be grounded in what perceives fluctuation. Once you see that thought is an object of observation rather than the source of observation, the nature of inquiry shifts. You begin to question not just what you think, but what thinking is. In this moment, you sense that knowledge may not arise from acquiring more ideas but from examining the structure that produces ideas. Awareness becomes a lens through which thought can be evaluated rather than assumed. Yet another question emerges, a question that cannot be resolved by logic alone. If thought cannot guarantee truth, what evaluates the truth of thought? You analyze the process of reasoning itself. Proofs seem authoritative because they follow defined rules, but those rules rely on unexamined starting points. A logical system cannot secure its own foundations. It can only operate within them. Even the most rigorous demonstration depends on assumptions accepted without proof. Al-Ghazali studied these limitations closely. He recognized that reason is indispensable for clarity but insufficient for certainty. It organizes thoughts, but it cannot determine the reliability of the thinker. It structures arguments, but it cannot escape the need for premises it cannot justify. You begin to understand that reason is a valuable instrument but not an independent source of truth. It clarifies but does not ground. It analyzes but does not anchor. It can point toward consistency, but consistency alone does not ensure reality. This realization raises a difficult question. If every proof depends on prior assumptions, where does certainty actually begin? You turn now toward the figure performing the search, the one you call yourself. You notice that even this sense of self is not constant. It shifts with mood, circumstance, expectation, and fear. You begin to see that the seeker is not a stable entity but a collection of transient conditions. Al-Ghazali recognized this instability in his own life. He understood that as long as the seeker remains unexamined, the search for truth remains compromised. A self driven by ambition, fear, or confusion cannot reliably approach certainty. The search cannot transcend the limitations of the one who searches. You start to consider that the very motivation to seek truth might arise from dissatisfaction rather than clarity. If the seeker is shaped by unexamined impulses, then the search is shaped by them as well. You confront an unsettling possibility. Perhaps truth is not absent. Perhaps it is obstructed by the one trying to grasp it. From here, the paradox becomes unavoidable. How can an unstable self discover a stable truth? You now recognize why Al-Ghazali withdrew from public life. He was not rejecting scholarship. He was questioning the mind that sought validation through it. He saw that certainty could not be achieved by collecting arguments or aligning with a particular intellectual group. It required a purification of the internal instrument that evaluates everything. You begin to follow that line of reasoning. Instead of asking whether an idea is true, you ask whether the internal conditions from which the idea arises are clear. You explore the motivations behind your conclusions. You question whether bias, desire, or fear influence what you accept as knowledge. Al-Ghazali described this inward turn as essential. The heart, understood as the center of awareness, must become free of distortion for truth to appear. The issue is not the lack of knowledge but the lack of clarity in the knower. You sense that accumulation cannot substitute for insight. Adding more ideas cannot correct the observer who misinterprets them. True inquiry requires observing what remains when the effort to gather more finally ceases. A new question takes shape. If truth is internal, why does the mind keep searching outside? You examine the energy behind seeking. You see that the search is driven by the belief that something essential is missing. You assume that with enough effort, clarity will appear as a possession. But when you investigate this belief directly, it loses its foundation. The sense of lack is not evidence of absence but a habit of thought. Al-Ghazali discovered that the search dissolves when its motive is understood. As long as you believe truth is external, you strengthen the separation between yourself and what you seek. But when you examine the seeker, the one who feels incomplete, the structure of seeking weakens. You start to see truth not as something to be obtained but as something that becomes visible when the movement of seeking relaxes. The search ends because the need to search ends, not because something external has been acquired. With this realization, the paradox becomes sharper. If the search ends without finding, what exactly ends? It is not truth that appears or disappears. It is the seeking self, the one who believed clarity needed to be chased. When this self-constructed identity dissolves, the movement of seeking has nothing left to sustain it. You are left with a quiet yet unavoidable question. If the search disappears, what remains to be seen? You now confront the limits of conceptual understanding directly. Thought can describe, compare, and analyze, but it cannot observe itself without contradiction. It cannot stand outside its own processes. To know the limits of thought, you must step into awareness, the position from which thought is seen. Al-Ghazali reached a point where he recognized that some forms of understanding arise not through argument but through direct illumination. This is not a supernatural claim. It is a description of the moment when the mind stops forcing structure and allows clarity to emerge on its own. When thought ceases to dominate, awareness can reveal what thought cannot construct. You begin to experience the difference between conceptual clarity and direct realization. Conceptual clarity organizes ideas. Direct realization shows what precedes them. Conceptual clarity depends on effort. Direct realization appears when effort becomes unnecessary. This shift does not reject thought. It places thought within a broader field. Thought becomes a tool rather than a ruler, an expression rather than a foundation. You sense that truth does not belong to thinking. It is revealed when thinking recognizes its limits. A new paradox emerges. If truth appears when thought is silent, what role does thought truly play? You arrive at the end of the inquiry, not through conclusion but through the exhaustion of questions. You recognize that the search was sustained by a self that assumed truth was separate from it. When that assumption dissolves, the search dissolves with it. In Al-Ghazali's understanding, certainty is not the possession of the mind but the absence of confusion within awareness. What remains is not an answer but a clarity that does not depend on argument or demonstration. Thought becomes quiet. The seeker fades. Nothing is obtained, yet nothing is missing. Truth remains when the searcher stops claiming it.